Good evening, everybody. India International Center, in collaboration with IIT Delhi and the Office of Principal Scientific Advisor to Government of India, have decided to start a year-long lecture series entitled Indian Women in Science and Technology. As a part of this program, the first lecture is going to be delivered today by Dr. Gagandeep Kang, an eminent scientist. She has been recently elected as a fellow of Royal Society. The topic of her talk is Friends, Heroes, Scientists, Women. She will share from her experience the dichotomy between professional competence and socio-cultural constructs. I extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Gagandeep Kang. I also welcome Professor K. Vijayaraghavan, Principal Scientific Advisor to Government of India, who has played a very key role in conceptualizing the series and in providing fund support to the series. A hearty welcome to you, sir. I also extend a very warm welcome to Shri Shyam Saran, our life trustee, who would be chairing the session today. He would also be introducing Dr. Gagandeep Kang to the audience. I further welcome Professor Ambu Sagar of IIT Delhi, who has played a very pivotal role in organizing this series. I extend a very hearty welcome to all of you. We are really looking forward to a very fruitful deliberations today. Thank you very much. Now I request Dr. Vijayaraghavan for delivering his remarks. Please.
If you want to.
No, you go.
Okay.
Good evening, everybody. I was just discussing with Ambassador Shyam Saran about the dangers of multiply introducing Gagandeep Kang. All of us are keen to do that, but that honor should be with him. Thank you very, very much, all of you, for being here today. This is hopefully the beginning of a very interesting and perhaps impactful series. And the series is conceived to have women, people at early stages in their career, middle, senior people, across technology, who will tell us about their work and what they're doing and in the context of what they're doing. And Ambassador Saran will tell you more about that, I'm sure. But I'll just introduce the more general question about where we are today with the role of women in science, technology, engineering, medicine, and so on, in leadership roles, and what are our challenges ahead of us. In that context, what is very interesting is to address both biology and sociology. And the reason why we need to address biology is that our explanations for why our societies are in certain ways or not often hinges on our recourse to biology in various ways. As far as biology goes, humans are the consequences of hundreds of millions of years of evolution from unicellular organisms. There are multiple kinds of multicellular organisms, and there are many, many animals which have behavior and nervous systems and functions and physiology which have many similarities with us. Many animals run, many animals walk, many animals taste and smell in ways we do, and so on and so forth. Some animals fly, we don't. And that brings us into sociology and how our societies grew. We are distinct from other animals in that over evolutionary time, we chanced upon ways by which we could throw objects, therefore make tools and engineer nature. We could speak and therefore communicate with each other and develop language. And that dramatically transformed us and our ways of communication over distances, this combination of engineering and language. And because of the way we cooked food, our brains grew disproportionate to our body. And therefore we could have over-designed computers in our brains which could deal with abstractions in the way no other animal can. And this combination resulted in our breaking our biological bounds and learning how to fly, for example, or go to outer space. Yet, when we deal with our societies, we often talk about biological limitations, when we have overthrown so many biological limitations. And one common argument given about the reason why we don't find women in leadership roles or women in employment in sectors in a manner which we find men is biological. But that argument is an untenable, incorrect argument because of all the reasons I've told you. Men and women are no longer constrained by their biological limitations because our societies, our memes, our language, our technologies have the ability to limit, if not completely overcome, whatever those limitations may or may not be. So why then do we find such disproportionate representation of women in public life? The answer must therefore lie not in biology, but in sociology and in economies and the way societies are structured. And our societies are structured in a very simple manner. When the man goes to work and spends 24/7 thinking about his job, he has a workforce behind which gets him ready for that purpose. And this workforce involves the woman and family members and a support system. And that economic vestige of early economic growth in our societies remains in a completely changing world. And it's time to overthrow that. And unless that changes fundamentally, and it's eminently overthrowable, we are going to be trapped in a system where we give biological excuses to problems which don't have their basis over there. What is the role of science and technology? Science and technology and our institutions have an extraordinary opportunity to, because these structures are flexible. They don't require you to come at a particular time and leave at a particular time. They have all sorts of other flexibilities about where you work, when you work, how you work, and so on and so forth. And therefore, in terms of setting examples, they have an incredible opportunity, which they now have started to grasp and need to grasp a lot more. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about how those kinds of opportunities are there and how they can be addressed. But I'd like to end by saying it's really fantastic to have Gagandeep Kang as the first speaker in our series. She is the first Indian citizen to be elected, a woman to be elected as a fellow of the Royal Society. And that society is several hundred years old. And Indians have been elected for over 100 years to the Royal Society. And it's really a great honor that we have her as the first woman. That she's absolutely fantastic. And I'm sure that she'll be the first of many more talented women to have such and other honors in our ecosystem. And we'll also soon, if we address the questions which are staring at us, I'm sure we'll have many more women in leadership positions. One last point. While going through all the topics which we want to discuss over this series, artificial intelligence, nanosciences, material sciences, space, astronomy, and so on, when we started listing these topics, we were told by several people, Dr. Aurobindo Mitra, Ambuj Sagar, and I were discussing this. We were told by several people, oh, but you can't find quality women speakers in all these areas. And when we all worked together, Ambuj and Aurobindo and I and Dr. Shyam, Saran and others at the Indian International Center found that in each area there were no shortage of quality women available. So that again is a sort of lazy statement to make about availability of women or not in specific areas, women of quality, women of leadership roles, and women of potential leadership. So I'm sure that the rest of the series will also have quality speakers there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vijayaraghavan, for those opening remarks. And let me thank you and Ambuj for joining the India International Center in presenting this series. As you have said that in all these various fields of science and technology, if there was any sort of concern that we may not be able to find in some of these cutting edge technologies, women scientists who could talk about their work and who could tell us about the kind of advances which are being made, we soon found that that was completely incorrect, and that there are a very large number of women who are really making a mark in all these fields. Let me say that this series is part of several such initiatives that India International Center is taking. We also have a parallel Women in Law series. Some of you may have attended a couple of lectures under that series, and there too we wanted to showcase that in the field of law we have very eminent and very, very brilliant lawyers and judges who have really made the mark in their respective fields. So this is really a celebration of the role of women in so many areas of national endeavor. And we also wanted to use these set of lectures to also, in fact, inspire the coming generation of younger women to really have as grand ambitions as they want, because really the sky is the limit. So in that context, I would very much like to express my gratitude to Dr. Gagandeep Kang, who has very kindly consented to be the first speaker in this series. And we are all very eager to hear her views on the subject, not only just in terms of the field that she is covering, but her own journey as a scientist in what is a very, very important field for India, because she's really working on the problem of diarrhea, particularly which affects children in our country. So the work she's doing has tremendous, social value. Professor Gagandeep Kang is a clinician scientist. She is a professor in the Department of Gastrointestinal Sciences at the Christian Medical College at Vellore, where she also studied, and is currently Executive Director of the Transnational Health Science and Technology Institute, which I believe is linked to the Department of Biotechnology, where she is a leading research scientist with a very major focus on viral infections in children and in the testing of rotaviral vaccines. She was awarded the prestigious Infosys Prize in Life Sciences in 2016 for her contributions in this field. And she has published nearly 300 scientific papers. As was pointed out by Dr. Vijayaraghavan, she is the first woman scientist to be elected Fellow of the Royal Society in its more than 350 years of history. So she is really, in that sense, a real role model for the younger generation. So I now have very great pleasure in giving the floor to Dr. Gagandeep Kaur. Would you like to speak from here? Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah.
पकड़ के रखियो, धीरे 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 धीरे, थोड़ा पीछे, बस बस बस।
So good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. You know, recently people have been saying a lot of things about me, and I always feel like I'm a bit of a fraud. And that's because I come from a place of privilege. I am from a section of society, as are all of you, where we have had ample opportunities to do the things that we have wanted to do. Women in our class of society are not restricted in terms of education. We get support in many shapes and forms. And when I look around me, I see women achievers everywhere. As was pointed out just now, if you look at fields of science and you look for women to speak about science in India, you will find them. So when I thought about, my journey in science, I thought I was doing what everybody else was doing until I started to look at the numbers. And this was an exercise that was sort of forced on me by the National Institutes of Health that asked me to measure in my institution how many women were there at every level of academia. And when I looked in the Christian Medical College Fellow, an institution started by a woman where there has been at least 40% women in every incoming class, I found that at assistant professor level, yes, it was 50-50. And then as you went up the scales, the proportion of women was decreasing. And then I started to see if this can happen in a place like CMC, what is the rest of the country like? And when I came to the Translational Health Science and Technology Institute, it was very interesting. There was one other woman on the faculty. So this, we are the exceptions when we come up here. And what I'm hoping to do in the next few minutes is first to tell you about my work, and then to tell you about how I got where I am today. If you look at this picture here, you can see that the child has a raised section of abdomen. This is called a pinch test. You do a pinch test when a child has diarrhea. When you take a fold of skin and pinch it, if it doesn't go back in 2 seconds, that means that the child is dehydrated and requires rehydration. Now, if you look at the size of people, we are a certain weight. Let's say the average person is about 60 kilos. The average baby at about 6 months of age, 7 months of age is about 6 kilos. But in terms of surface area, the baby has about a quarter of the surface area at a tenth the weight. That means when dehydration happens, it happens much faster in children. And why is that important? Because dehydration can kill. So what I work on is this really rather pretty virus that is shown up here. This is obviously a reconstruction. It's a very simple virus. It has 12 proteins. And one of those proteins, which is a non-structural protein, actually affects the cells in the gut. What it leads to through a mechanism of calcium signaling is a lot of chloride secretion into the gut. When chloride and iron is secreted into the gut, water follows. And if the colon can't absorb the amount of water that is coming into the gut, we get diarrhea. And loss of fluid from diarrhea can lead to dehydration. Rotavirus actually has another trick up its sleeve. It causes vomiting. So if all of you know that when you have diarrhea, what you want to do is give fluids, it becomes a little difficult to give fluids orally when you have both vomiting and diarrhea. So that's why if you can't get children to care quickly enough, they can die. Now what I've been doing, and this pyramid here is about 10 years of work for me. Essentially what we have done is study diarrhea in the community, study diarrhea in the hospital, and make estimates for how much death is caused by diarrhea. So if you take the 27 million children that are born in India every year, 1 in 2 children will have a diarrhea, 1 in 8 children will require an OPD visit for that diarrhea, 1 in 30 children will be hospitalized, and 1 in 350 children will die. How do we know this? Because we did the community studies, we did studies all around India in hospitals, and for the deaths, we had some deaths in our community and hospital populations, but we also looked at government estimates of how many children were dying of diarrhea in different places. We also looked at what this meant for households. If you have a child admitted with diarrhea, and you work in the kinds of places where we were doing the surveillance, a rotavirus hospitalization cost 5% of the median annual household income. So not only do you have a child who is sick enough to be in a hospital, you're also taking a significant economic hit because of this virus. So we did studies in the community trying to understand how we could protect against this virus. And the first studies we did really were rather disappointing. There were studies that had been done in other parts of the world that showed that essentially if your child had 2 rotavirus infections, natural infections, they would be protected from diarrhea. But if you looked at children in our slums, 2 infections gave you 57% protection, and 3 gave you 80% protection. We plugged that information into a model and said, if we have a vaccine, we think the vaccine is going to give us about 45 to 50% protection, and we don't think that that protection is going to last. In rich countries, we think that they get much better protection and that protection lasts for a long time. That will not be the case when vaccines are brought to India. Nonetheless, given the fact that we have so many diarrheal infections, we also estimated that if we had a vaccine that was even 50% effective as we were predicting, this would save 30,000 lives every year. We worked with a very large consortium, and that resulted in a rotavirus vaccine that was supported by the Department of Biotechnology for over 20 years, and finally was made by an Indian company, Bharat Biotech, and was introduced into the National Immunization Program in 2016. Now, in order to see whether the vaccine was really working very well or not, we did a study where we had 34 hospitals looking at children who were admitted with diarrhea, then looking backwards to see whether they had vaccine or not, and then seeing whether the vaccine was working or not. Now, when you do a trial, when you're testing vaccines, you actually usually take really healthy babies and then you follow them up to see if they are protected. In the trials that we did towards licensure, those babies had protection, about 55% protection. So that was what our model had predicted, and we found it in the vaccine trial. But we wanted to see whether in the real world, was that the case? And these data are just emerging, they are unpublished, but what it shows us is that the vaccine protection is really as much as we saw in the efficacy studies in the first year of life. But this is the real world, and all children are not healthy. And if you look at chronically malnourished children, they are usually stunted. Stunted is they are short for their age, and that's a sign of chronic malnutrition. And if you look here, you see that in the first year of life, stunted children are reasonably well protected, but they have no protection in the second year of life. Normally nourished children maintain the protection. So what we had predicted in our model, which was built on stunted children, is holding up. Now, why is this important for us? When you look at children who live in really poor areas, these children take multiple hits. This particular girl was born low birth weight. She was weaned early, so she had very little breastfeeding. Her mother is not particularly educated. She is the first child. This is her growth chart. Where we would like to see her is up here, where she actually is, as you can see here, is pretty low down. This should be her height on the green line. This red line indicates a height for age score of -2. She's actually well below that score. So this is a chronically malnourished child. She looks healthy, doesn't she? So stunting is a hidden burden of malnutrition that we don't see. What else do stunted children have? One of the things that I've tried to understand is the gut environment. And to do that, I said, these are children in slums. Why don't we look at rich kids as well? Now, if you know the Christian Medical College Vellore, you know that we are not rich. But we are better off than people who live in slums. And what we did was measure two things. One was measure how many potentially dangerous bugs there were in these children's guts. And we found that if you look in the slum area, each child that looks healthy had 4 bugs. Looks healthy, no diarrhea, 4 bugs. Doctors' children in Vellore, 1 bug. So 4 times greater pathogens being carried in their guts. If you look at inflammatory markers, again, we measured them in doctors' children and in children in the slums, and you can see what the doctors' children were like, pretty close to 0. Children in the slums had really high counts. This was about 1,600. Do you know what the diagnosis for inflammatory bowel disease is? Above 200. So our children have 8 times greater inflammation in their guts than somebody who has a diagnosis as an adult of inflammatory bowel disease. So their guts are getting damaged. What does that mean? That means you have chronic malnutrition, and in our setting, we find that children have about 30% stunting. We thought, what does this stunting do? We can see what happens to their physical development, but what's happening to their mental development? So we've been tracking these children now for nearly 20 years, and what we find is that the median IQ in slums is 89. That is low normal. 90 to 110 is normal. So if our median IQ is like this, that means that there is a distribution around it. And when we look at children who have been persistently stunted for long periods of time, their IQs are significantly lower than children who have never been stunted. So what this means in terms of our society, in terms of what it will do to our economy, has been measured by people overseas. It's been estimated that for every 5 points that you lose in IQ, you actually lose about 10% in your terminal income. This is a problem for India. Between 3 and 4 out of 10 children in India are chronically stunted in more than 200 districts. There is no district with less than 10% stunting. And this has a distribution where it's worse in the north and the center of the country than in the south. And our data are from the south. We have no measurements of this kind from the north. So how did I get to doing this kind of work? My father was in the railways. That meant that we moved a lot. And these are all the places that I lived before I went to Vellore. So when you move a lot, unlike in the army where you get furniture, in the railways you have to move your entire household, every last bit of it. This is my mother. She is an expert in logistics. She could pack and unpack a house in 3 days flat. We moved during our holidays from school to school. I studied in 10 different schools. That taught me a lot about flexibility. My father and my mother were responsible for me playing catch-up every time I went to a new school, because in those days, every school had a different system of education, so you had to figure out what had been going on in classes before you got there, and then try and make your way up. And then I went to medical school, and this was the first time that I actually stayed in one place for 5 years. And then I've stayed there pretty much ever since. I think what medical school taught me was that there are a lot of things that are unexpected that are thrown at you. You have classes. I spent a lot of time not attending classes. I spent a lot of time hanging out with friends, making new friends. Vellore had this wonderful system of foster families where you get taken into households, and sometimes you gel and sometimes you don't. You desperately, as all students do, study for exams. But I think what mattered to me most was the fact that we spent a lot of time doing things that had nothing to do with medicine. So the highlight of my career was being the person who did props for Evita. And I made a lot of friends who have stayed friends since then. After I finished my MBBS, I had to think about what I really wanted to do, and it had to be an MD. I didn't think I was cut out to be a surgeon. And I thought about ophthalmology, I thought about psychiatry, and then I finally wound up doing microbiology, and at the end of it, the only thing I could think of to say is, I don't really want to do this day in and day out. So I discussed it with a lot of friends, with a lot of people, and decided that I would go into a field that was about research. And why diarrhea? Because diarrhea is complicated. If you look at most other sites in the body, if you're studying infectious disease, you're dealing with sterile environments, so that when you find a bug, it's almost inevitably causing a disease. Diarrhea, the gut environment, is much, much more complicated because it isn't sterile. So you have to figure out each time what is going on. And the gut has complicated functions. Immunity is obviously important. As I told you with the rotavirus vaccine, we don't respond as well. Nutrition is also an important function of the gut, and that's determined both by the damage that is done to the cells in the gut, as well as the composition of the flora that is within your gut. And these are issues that we are working on now. Now, after that, when you work in an environment that is about medicine and research, the one thing that we almost never do is at a junior level tell people that they are doing a good job. And when I had the opportunity, I got a fellowship and I had the opportunity to go to the UK and then went to the US, I found that that was the first time that people were telling me, hey, you can do this. They believed in me and they thought I could get things done. You have to acquire some level of street credibility for yourself. So I did the Royal College of Pathology membership exams, and I wound up in the US working with this absolutely amazing woman, Mary Estes. She brought me into rotavirus and has been a support system ever since. When you are doing well in the UK and the US, obviously you have the question, why not stay here? It's such a comfortable environment. You can do so much research there. But the one thing that I realized during my time there is that if I stayed there, I would be one of 1,000, 100,000 people who could do this. If I came back to India and brought with me all of the new tools that I had acquired, I would be one among very few who were able to do this, and maybe I could use these tools to solve problems. Now, that was aspirational, that was really wonderful, that you think you're going to be idealistic and save the world, and then you find that things are a lot harder than you had anticipated. And for me, they were even harder, because when I came back, a lot of the people who were supposed to work with me got bumped up to other positions, so I wound up having to handle a lot of different things by myself. So that's when I had to call on all kinds of support systems. So I have phenomenal friends. My roommate, my classmates sort of rallied around whenever I needed them. When I had to write my PhD thesis, my friends stayed up with me because I had 2 children. I had to look after them during the day, but she would sit with me and we would type together. So, that helps. This lady is Anna Jacob. She passed away 2 years ago. She is my husband's great aunt. She became a nurse in 1932 and became nursing superintendent of Christian Medical College, Vellore, and was nursing superintendent for 28 years. She flew for the first time in 1947 and sailed across the Atlantic to go to college at McGill. I met her when I got married, and she became a role model for me. Somebody who was always cheerful, who had lots of stories to tell, and had done incredible things in her life at a time that was much more difficult than the time I was facing problems. And she always had a smile on her face and an ability to calm you down, which I think is really important when you're getting stressed out by multiple problems. This is Sashireka Ramani. She is my first PhD student. She is now an assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine. When you start out with your first student, you don't know how to handle things, so it's a learning experience for both of you. I think we did a reasonable job because I'm really proud of the fact that now she is streets ahead of me when we talk about science. So which ones are friends, heroes, which ones are scientists? I think all of them are friends, my heroes, and scientists. These are the women that I work with. I can tell you when I first started my cohort, you have lots of learning experiences along the way. And we were thinking about how to keep women in the cohort, particularly if you want to keep them for really long periods of time. And one of the things that I thought about was, when it's their child's birthday, can we ask them to come into the clinic and we'll take a photograph of them and we'll frame the photograph and we'll give it to them as a gift. This was obviously before everybody had a smartphone. So these are many of the women that I've worked with, and all of these children are now adolescents and are still in our studies. I think working in the community reminds you of why you are doing the work that you're doing. And the kinds of problems that these women have had, whether it is domestic violence, whether it is husbands getting into debt and then the wives needing to go out and work, when their children have had serious illnesses, the way that they take their problems, handle them, has taught me a lot. So what have I learned in 30 years of being in science? I think having a strong foundation, having a strong family and friends has been really, really valuable. I think what has distinguished me from others is I'm quite willing to desperately cry for help when I need it. And help has always come. I think being curious, asking questions, and looking for answers is the way for women to go in science. It's the way for everybody to go in science. We will either solve problems or we'll figure out that they can't be done quite that way. I think staying with problems, giving up too easily, going into too many different areas are problems. If you stay with a question long enough, you will figure out the answers. And I think the most important thing to remember, and this is where my feeling of being a fraud comes into it, is actually from talking to my peers, to my students, I'm finding out that I am making a difference. And I think that this is really important. So it's time for me to become really, really ambitious. I don't know why that picture flipped like that, not supposed to be that way. But what I'm going to do next is start working on pregnancy risk stratification, and I'm going into a border district of Assam to work with a wonderful group of people who have established a hospital there. I think if you look at these figures, you will understand exactly why I think this work needs to be done in that location. This is work that I want to do in the community. There is also work that I want to do in a laboratory and a hospital. And for that, I'm planning to think about human infection studies, so asking volunteers to infect themselves with pathogens that cause diseases in our populations. Why did I think about this? Because this is an Oxford undergraduate. The typhoid conjugate vaccine is made in India. And they had to take it to Oxford to test whether the vaccine would work or not, because we don't do these kinds of studies here. This is what I would like to establish. I think we should be thinking about innovation for ourselves. If these kinds of systems help us to get answers, if we can really investigate responses to vaccines and drugs on our populations, our chances of getting them out to people are that much higher and going to be faster. So to end, I think the most important thing that I have learned is that my environment shaped me. I am what I am because of all the influences that I have had, because of all the support systems that I have had. When we think about women in science, I think the most important thing to remember, particularly for people who do not come from a place of privilege like us, is that you cannot be what you cannot see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gagandeep, for what was a very erudite, but more than that, a very human and inspiring story. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure that all of us present here, agree with that. Evaluation. We have about 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. If any one of you would like to address a question to Gagandeep, you are most welcome to please raise your hand and please identify yourself and any organization that you are affiliated with. Shall we take one by one or shall we take 2 or 3 together? No. Anyone who would like to ask a question? Yes, please.
Gagandeep, that was a truly inspiring, and in some way it resonated with my own experience. I'm also a microbiologist. I'm Dr. Gita Mehta. And I just wanted to ask you, what was your children's attitude while you were going through all this? And how, because in my experience has been the most agonizing thing for a mother is, when you have to do things and when your child is on the other side and you have to balance that. So I just wanted to know how you manage that. Thank you.
I think what you need here is good friends and family. So I could call on my family and my friends, and we actually lived kind of in a commune. So parents shared responsibilities. Frequently we didn't know where our children were because they were in somebody else's house. So that worked out really well when they were young. When they were older, I think I consciously decided that I was not going to be to pander to certain aspects of them. I remember when my younger son once said dishwashing was a woman's job. He washed all the dishes after that.
Yes, please.
Good evening, everyone. Ma'am, actually, I'm very curious to know
Will you
that...
please identify yourself?
My name is Kusum and I'm a teacher.
Okay.
I was curious to know that what were the social challenges which you faced during your research work?
Ordinarily, if I look at what I've done, I would say I didn't have too many challenges, but if I look, I didn't think of them as challenges when I was facing them. When I look back now, I think about many things that happened and I recognize that those were actually social challenges. Whether it was people in authority in my department telling me, you can only work on this and you have to follow what we are telling you to do, or institutional constructs that said that, you have to be or come in with 1.5 or twice what anybody else had to do. So those challenges exist. I handled the first one by saying, I'll do whatever you're asking me to do, but I will also do what I want to do, which did not go down well. The other one, I took it once I had people help me out. The rest of the time I said I will raise so much resources that nobody will be able to deny me anything. I've been reasonably good at that.
Yes, please.
I'm Vikas Mulchanda, working with Department of Empowerment of Persons with Disabilities. You just said that you have been watching this problem for last 20 years. Children have been suffering this malnutrition and other problems. I want to know when our country will overcome and how our country will overcome this problem, because 20 years is a very long period.
So I can tell you that things are improving. So when I started my first cohorts, we were at 65% stunting at the age of 2. And 10 years later, we were at 30% stunting. With every new cohort we recruit, things are getting better. In Tamil Nadu, it was the midday meal scheme that made a difference. There are more programs that focus on monitoring of nutrition in Tamil Nadu. If you measure things, then you have an incentive to change them. If you're not measuring, you don't know the size of the problem and you won't try to fix it. So I think in public health, measurement and continued measurement is the most important thing.
Yes, please.
I'm Sagari Chabra. I'm a columnist and director of the Hamara Itihas Archive. I want to ask you, first of all, congratulations on being the first Indian woman to become a fellow at this prestigious place. We are very proud of you. And I do want to say that when I was a graduate student at Washington State University many years ago, I found that in the United States there was a whole system to support and mentor women in science. I find that in India, I chose also to come back to India and live and work in India, and it's a decision I've never regretted, because as you said, we can make a difference. But at the same time, I feel that the powers that be behave as if women who work do not have children, and if they have children, they should not work. I want your comments on that, because for many years now, I have been raising an issue that it should be mandatory that every institution that is where land is transferred to the people by the state, there should be a room where parents can place their children, so that child rape, which has gone up by 400%, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, would come down, because we are always taking care of our kids. I would like your response to that. Thank you.
I couldn't agree with you more. The first thing I did when I came to THSTI was start a creche and create spaces for women. I don't think men even think about these things most of the time, and frequently when governments and departments do, there are a few people who are engaged enough to think through everything. In many cases, it's tokenism. So how do we transform that token effort into something that is real and substantial? That will happen when you have women commenting on what is being done, measuring what is being done.
And we often silence.
Yes, please.
Ma'am, I can tell you I'm very proud of your achievements. I've been a feminist. I can define myself as a first-generation feminist. I'm already in my 80s. But I want to know, firstly, and no offense to my brothers there, is the representation of women in science technology as uneven as people sitting on the dais? Please, don't feel offended. I'm not passing any judgments on our men, because feminists are always supposed to be hating men and all. I'm not one of those. I love my husband, I love my father, I love my son. So there's no problem, but it's still, really I would like to know if really is representation of women as low as this. Secondly, I would have liked to know also, do women who enter science and technology face any additional problems that women generally face, at least in this country, or certainly my generation has faced? One of them, of course, has been the conflict between her domestic duties and professional duties. We have not yet sorted that out. But otherwise, are there really additional obstacles to reach at some higher positions in science technology than maybe as I was in my field of sociology or economics or whatever? I'd like to be enlightened a little on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no offense taken about the... Please.
Yes, there are fewer women. The representation is poor. And the higher you go, the less women there are. That is something that has been documented over and over, not just in India, but in almost all parts of the world. Do women in science face additional challenges? No, they don't. This is, women face problems in every part of society. Working women face the same problems everywhere. I think one of the ways that I think about women and the problems they face is think about women in medicine versus women in more basic science. Why are we more accepting of women doctors continuing their profession for longer periods of time than women scientists in many fields? I think it's partly economic empowerment, that you're more willing to let a woman work when she's going to bring in significant resources into the household. But that is only part of the story.
Yes, please.
Hello, sorry, my throat is a little bit not well. I'm Anant, and I'm from IIT Delhi. I just graduated last year, and then I worked as a visiting scientist in Germany in the Institute for Molecular Infection Biology. And I'm actually very impressed by your ideas. And there was one particular point which caught my attention, and that was about your recent aim, which is to develop new vaccines, but also you are trying to target the audience to get voluntary trials. So in that area, what I'm very concerned is for these trials, it's not usually the people who are very rich or very well educated, they will come forward. For those trials, the people who need money, the people who are already actually from very poor background, they will be coming forward, not because they are really curious about it, but because they really need the money. And also, when we are developing these kind of trials, antibiotic resistance might develop. So how will you tackle these kind of problems? I mean, do you also have a model system to answer those kind of challenges in advance? So,
absolutely. So the idea of volunteer infection studies and truly volunteer infection studies have been done around the world for the past 50 years. They are very common in the US, the UK, in many developed countries, and they are also being done in developing countries, Kenya, Tanzania, Thailand. Many places are doing these kinds of studies, because we've realized that informing science, particularly when you look at infectious diseases, prior exposure determines your response to a pathogen or to a vaccine. So if you study it in Oxford, you're not going to get the same answers as if you study it in India. So that's why it is important to study it there. Now, who do you study it in? Right? The people in whom you actually establish the model, figure out how the model is going to be done, derive no benefit from it. People in whom you test a vaccine at least have the potential to derive benefit from it. So we've done public perception studies to look at what people think about, what would make people trust the system enough to come forward and volunteer for these studies. The one thing that came up that was most important was, if the medical community wants to do this, why aren't they testing it on themselves? So we discussed this idea among the doctors that I work with, and everybody was, yeah, sure, let's participate. And this, for the studies that have no benefit, I have 20 doctors ready to participate. These are precisely the upper class people that you're talking about. Altruism isn't dead.
Before I get back to the audience, I had two questions. One is, you mentioned when you were showing your slides that a lot of the data that is the basis for your work is all from the south, mainly. And you said that we do not have much data from the north. Why is that so? That is one question. And the second question is, you mentioned the importance of the support system that you had, whether it is friends or whether it is colleagues. I noticed that in all that categorization, there were very few men.
I do
Why?
have a few male friends, but they don't look after my children. So the first question, in India, where clinical medical research is concerned, we have islands of excellence. And in this case, diarrhea, as we discussed, is not a glamorous field. There weren't many people working on diarrhea, so most of the data that has been generated has come from a very limited number of groups. And the deeper, I think I've probably done some of the deepest dives into diarrhea in India. There are other places. Calcutta has the National Institute of Cholera and Infectious Diseases, and here at AIIMS, Dr. Rajbhan, who is a leader in the field, and his group did much of the early work that I only followed. In terms of not having enough men in the support system, well, I do have a husband and 2 children, and I think the men didn't support the activities that were time consuming, but they provided support in many other ways. And in terms of putting me forward for leadership positions, for recognitions, certainly there have been men.
Some redeeming features at least. Yes, please.
I'm Dr. Chog, a microbiologist again like you, and currently National Emeritus Professor in the National Academy of Medical Sciences. What is amazing is I have also done some research, but hospital-based. What is amazing in your work is the community-based work, which is much, much harder than doing some good work in the hospitals. I think Vellore has great traditions. I have been there a few times, and I know of people with whom you have worked, like John, George, etc. I think the 2 amazing things that we must carry message is community-based research. Second, Vellore has a great tradition of not bothering about the salaries. As you said yourself, money was never an important issue for you, okay? I think we all must try to inculcate that spirit of doing the community-based work or the field studies. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Yes, please. Very short question, please.
Yeah. Dr. Sarojit Dudeja. Madam, I did PhD in muscular dystrophy, which is another rare disease, and there is no treatment even today. My question is regarding your water and malnutrition. You may be knowing after this Prime Minister Swachh Bharat scheme, do you have any perception what has impact on these type of disease, diarrhea and other? And in Punjab, one district whole is suffering from water pollution. That's a very carcinogenic, and one train is going from Bhatinda to Jaipur for a chemotherapy. That train is called a Cancer Express. So why not to have a preventive measure than to have a curative, like you said, vaccine? So what's your thought?
So I think there, if you look at water quality and the impact of sanitation interventions, the effect of sanitation interventions done today will be seen years from now, because it requires penetration in the community up to a certain level. I've done a lot of studies on water and sanitation. And I think where water safety is concerned, part of the problem is that we are depleting our groundwater at such rapid rates that being able to control contamination of that water is going to get harder and harder. So I don't think that we are going to have vaccine solutions to these problems.
Yes, please.
Very briefly, when you said that in UK...
Can you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm Sudhir K. Jain. I was professor and head of the Department of Management at IIT Delhi.
Okay.
I spent a long time, and now I am at JNU in the newly created Atal Bihari Vajpayee School of Management and Entrepreneurship. Madam, you said that the volunteers are available in UK and other countries for taking something so that you get the disease and then you go for. In India, they are not available. People are selling the kidneys and all that, and volunteers are not available. I am surprised.
No, it isn't a case of volunteers are not available, but one of the things that I've always been very careful about is to respect the people that I work with. And that includes people who participate in the studies that we do. For me, part of respect is making sure that no one is ever coerced into a study. No one is ever over-incentivized into participating in a study. A volunteer must be a true volunteer with informed consent. They must understand. One of the things that we do is what is called a paternalistic attitude, where we think people are vulnerable when they aren't. So in many of the communities, in the communities that I've worked with, I have had parents who have put their children through studies that have required considerable commitment on their part, to have people visit, to bring their child to the clinic, to be able to give us stool samples, blood samples, saliva samples, urine samples. And we explain the studies to them and they participate. What we do at the end of the study is assess how they thought the study went. I think for me, the proof that we do things the right way is when parents come back and say, our first child was in this study, when are you starting another one?
Any other question? Well, thank you very much, Gagandeep, for, sorry. Okay, one last question. Sorry.
I am Dr. Saroj Prakash, former professor of medicine at Lady Hardinge and Maulana Azad Medical College. Now I'm just retired and doing sort of charitable work, mostly charitable work, and teaching. Research in India is a little difficult, community research. In the institutions, it's not so difficult. You can follow. Follow-up is the one which I find is the most difficult. We did a lot of work with Dr. Padmavati was my mentor on rheumatic heart disease in women. And it was very, very difficult. And the family would not bring the patients for the follow-up. So that part, I really appreciate that the community work you have done is really, really remarkable, I think.
Thank you very much. Again, as I was saying, thank you very much, Gagandeep, for what was really a very, very inspiring address. And thank you very much for answering all the queries that were raised by members of the audience in such a patient manner. Thank you for your time. I will now request Ambuj to please deliver the vote of thanks.
This way from here, right? Good evening. It's really my pleasure to deliver the vote of thanks at the end of this actually very delightful evening. First of all, really, just following up on Mr. Saran's point, I think really our deepest thanks to you, Gagandeep, for making the time in your schedule, which I'm sure is even more hectic than before after your new award. So thank you very much for finding the time. And really, I think a remarkable talk, because both giving an insight about your work and the importance of the work, but also the environment in which the work is carried out, which is exactly what we had hoped to do with this kind of a seminar series, which is highlight the really fantastic work that many women scientists and engineers are doing across the country, but also sharing their insights and experiences in that story. So I think this is absolutely perfect for us. And in fact, it's really both appropriate and indeed a privilege to have you as the inaugural speaker of our series. So thank you very, very much for that. And also obviously thank you to Dr. Vijayaraghavan for your, as always, stimulating remarks, your opening remarks. And
Mr. Shyam for chairing it, and managing the discussion in your always gentle but firm fashion. So thank you very much for that. Obviously, thanks to all the members of the audience for being here. And without your presence and participation, no event of this kind is good. So thank you for a very lively conversation after the discussion that really teases out some really important points about exactly the kind of questions that we are hoping will come up during this seminar series. And also, obviously, thanks to my colleagues here at the India International Center for hosting this lecture and making sure that everything, as always, goes really smoothly. I want to just end by saying that this question of women in science and technology that has been, other people have also mentioned its importance. It's been mentioned obviously by many of the people in the audience and who are here because they think it's an important issue. It really cannot be overstated. And both from the point of view of building a dynamic and vibrant science and technology enterprise in the country. So as somebody thinks about science and technology in the country, I think it's absolutely imperative that we think about this question of women in science and technology. But also, it's very much part of building a just and inclusive society. I mean, women should have the same kind of opportunities that men do, and I think, so it's not just people who are thinking about science and technology who have to think about this, but as Vijay said very correctly, I think it's a sociological question that we have to think about. And so therefore, for me, both personally and as somebody from IIT, from the head of the School of Public Policy, it's a pleasure to be collaborating with colleagues here at the India International Center, Mr. Srivastava, Mr. Saran and Ambassador Saran and their colleagues, and Dr. Vijayaraghavan and his colleagues at the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor, to both highlight the accomplishments of many of the leading Indian women scientists and engineers, but also learning from their experiences and also to be inspired by the work that they've done. So we're hoping that this lecture series, which this was an inaugural lecture of this series, it puts a much needed spotlight on this issue of women in science and technology, catalyzes a discussion among academics, among policymakers, and among the general public on this question, and inspires, hopefully, men, women of all ages to think about this question, and hopefully at least for women, especially I can talk about many of my women students and younger colleagues at IIT to have them be inspired and also learn lessons from how to move forward in their own professional careers. And as somebody who thinks about public policy, I also hope that this kind of a conversation will inspire some of us at IIT and actually with colleagues at Dr. Vijayaraghavan's office to think about what a larger focused effort on both understanding and enhancing the participation of women in science and technology might mean. So for me, this lecture series is not just actually a set of conversations, but hopefully also providing insights and providing a foundation for a much larger effort of thinking about this question. So the next talk in this series will be at IIT Delhi. We haven't yet finalized the date, but we'll get back to you very soon on that. And I look forward to having many of you in this series as it continues. Thank you, Gagandeep, and thanks again to all of you.
Thank you very much.